Rosental, you can start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Paloma. I'm Rosental Alves. I'm a journalism professor at the University of Texas at Austin, from where we are doing this FORO URGENTE. And I have the pleasure to have here with me two distinguished colleagues who are going to be the main speakers of this session. Kurt Weyland, a professor in the Department of Government. His research interests focus on democratization and authoritarian rule, on social policy and policy diffusion, and on populism in Latin America and Europe. He has done extensive field research in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Peru, and Venezuela. He received his MA in Latin American Studies from UT in 1986, and a PhD from Stanford in 91. And we have also Dr. Sean Theriault, who is a professor at the Department of Government here at UT Austin. He specializes in American politics, with particular interest focusing on the US Congress, American political development, and political history. Theriault has published articles on presidential rhetoric, congressional careers, issue framing, the Compromise of 1850, and public approval of Congress. He's a 2004 winner of the Eyes of Texas Excellence Award. So, Sean, I would start with you, because I think what happened in Brazil on January 8 has a lot of similarities with what happened in January 6 here. But before, let me just, as a kind of an intro, everybody knows that what happened in January 8th, just a few days ago, that, hundreds or a few thousand Bolsonaristas had a demonstration in Brasilia and invaded and vandalized in horrible ways not only the Congress, like it happened in Washington on the terrible January 6th, but also the Supreme Court and the presidential palace, Palácio do Planalto. So one thing that is to note, I would say, is that we Brazilians have, or some of us have, always thought that it's hard to find a country that looks like the United States, like Brazil. And this is not new. I mean, this is even from the very formation of the Republic, from previous to the Republic, Dom Pedro, our emperor, would come here to the United States, would look at the United States as the powerhouse that was being built in the 19th century, and then you have lots of comparisons, etc. But I think we should not exaggerate, as Brazilians have been exaggerating, to imitate even the bad things, right? I mean, because what Bolsonaro represented was such a cynical copycat of Trump that the similarities are beyond just a politician inspired by other. It's almost like copying immediately. Like, for example, Trump here started attacking the press, and Bolsonaro changed the hatred that he always had against the free press, and start doing similar vocabulary. Then Trump canceled the subscriptions of the White House of the New York Times. Bolsonaro canceled the subscription of Folha de São Paulo and said nobody should read that, etc. And then the pandemic, which was even worse, was abominable what he did. And even when Trump started being under control after saying so many crazy things, Bolsonaro kept saying the same things. The other thing that I'm sorry if the intro is a little longer, but the other thing is the influence of the ultra-right American movement in Brazil. I mean, with this abundant evidence of how Steve Bannon and others of the Trump circle have been very active inciting the Brazilian extremist movement. So, Sean, this was just to frame a little bit the comparison, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Oh, well, thank you, Rosental. Right, so I'll just pick up right where you left off. And that is that you say, right, like Trump would do something and Bolsonaro would do something, right, kind of mimicking him. But I actually think that there is more of a synergistic relationship between them, right? So I think that Trump would do something, Bolsonaro would do something, and then Trump would do something else, and then Bolsonaro would do something, right? And I think it's not only the two of them, but I think that we can put, right, Erdogan in this category. I think we can put Viktor Orban in this category. And I think they all just kind of fed off each other, right? And they expanded, I think, the envelope of what we would view as normal behavior coming out of democratically elected politicians, right? And so, right, just picking up where you were, but thinking a little bit more broadly, right? So going back to January 6th, we should recognize first that we're still in the first couple of weeks after January 8th. And I think the narrative that we thought happened on January 6th is 2 weeks later, isn't the same narrative we have about January 6th today. I think it's only been with the investigations, with the January 6th committee, with the investigation by the Justice Department, that we really learned about all of the steps that led up to January 6th. Right. I think that coming out of January 6th, in the first couple of weeks after, we thought that, right, there was nothing more than this Trump rally in the morning that incited his super fans to then go demonstrate in front of the Capitol. But I think what we know now about January 6th is that there was a much longer path. There was much more organization. There was much more coordination that was happening leading up to January 6th, such that we can't think of it as being an instantaneous kind of people's heart were raptured under Trump and they followed his directions from a morning speech. And so I think that in Brazil, we're going to be going through that same sort of process of the investigation, trying to find out what exactly happened. Now, there are some critical differences that we need to put out there from the very beginning. The first critical difference was, right, this is the most important day for Congress in the transition of power for a president. Right, January 6th is when the votes are tallied, where a president is officially declared, right? Like this is the day for Congress. And this is the day that, right, we have the insurrection happening at the US Capitol. As opposed to in Brazil, where we have an inauguration, we have a guy that's not even there. The people that they're super fans of was in Florida, right, with Trump. Interesting, right? Like, so, right, like that's just a critical difference. I think another critical difference is the way that the people, the military, the police kind of were treated, and then the reactions afterward, right? Like, I think that heading into January 6th, I don't think any of us thought that the military would be on the side of the Constitution, right? Like that, like, I don't think anyone thought that for however pro-Trump certain people in the military were, we can't ever imagine them going against the constitutional mandates. And in Brazil, like, I think we have a little bit different situation. And so I think that that's, right, another one of those critical differences. But before we want to, right, say January 6th and January 8th, a couple of years later, right, like we should discount them and, right, these are just kind of one-off protests and stuff like that. The danger, I think, is not necessarily what happened in the United States, although what happened in the United States was awful. And the danger isn't only what happened in Brazil, and there's no doubt that what happened in Brazil was awful. But my big concern is that we now have these two shining examples in countries that we think of as being pretty democratic. And my concern is when we get to less democratic regimes, right? Like there now is a little bit of a playbook. And so I'm worried about like what this means for Peru and what this means for Honduras and what this means for El Salvador. And some of those countries that don't have nearly the history of democracy that we have here. And I guess, and I'll wrap up by saying, right, it makes perfect sense why I'm here talking about January 6th. But what doesn't make sense to me is why Kurt Weyland was invited. I mean, the guy studies populism. He's done research in Brazil. He studies authoritarian leadership, but I don't know anything that he could contribute to this conversation. And with that, I'll pass it over to him.
Yeah, so Kurt, you can, but just let me make a note about Sri Lanka, because I was very impressed by the number of Bolsonaristas who were using Sri Lanka as an example. I mean, out of all these ultra right movements in all the countries that you mentioned, etc., they came up with that idea that of an invasion of a presidential palace, right? Kurt, so where do you start?
So where I start is that these events were awful in the norm breaking, the totally unprecedented nature of things. I mean, you know, the US Congress, I think, had been burned down by the English in 1814 or something like that. So, you know, more than 200 years before, and had never been breached. It's sacrosanct, right? I mean, it is a temple of democracy, and that to be attacked, and attacked in that way where the police gets beaten up and mistreated and pushed aside. And I mean, I think it was an unbelievable break of norms. And I mean, in similar way in Brazil, where just the vandalistic destruction was really out of control. So what I, first of all, I think I completely agree with Sean that the US invasion of the capital had some kind of political rationale. You can say there was some kind of plan, right? You interrupt that certification of the vote, you hope against all hope that maybe Mike Pence will change or something will, you know, there's some kind of, if you want to use the term, rational idea behind that, right? In the Brazilian case, I mean, as Sean said, the president had been inaugurated. There was, to the best of my knowledge, no plan. There was nothing to interrupt. This was, in many ways, much more kind of a sheer expression of anger and destructiveness and vandalism. The idea that the Brazilian military would take this act as the trigger for making the coup that they would have had ample opportunity to make in the 2.5 months before and didn't make is just so kind of outlandish that that Brazilian invasion of the three powers strikes me as sort of the act of desperados. There was no observable rationale behind that. And I think for that reason, and my reading of the US case is also that I'm less concerned that this will be kind of an example that will be imitated elsewhere, because it had no real result and no payoff. And I've actually been impressed how much in the US case, those people who organized this and really tried to use it as an insurrection have been prosecuted and been punished with pretty serious penalties and prison sentences and whatever. And so my sense is that in both cases this has backfired. And there, the Brazilian case is in some sense more heartening because the condemnation was from early on across the board. You know, in the US case, you had initially people coming out pretty uniformly and condemning this, you know, Kevin McCarthy and whatever. And then you had this big turnaround where the Trump kind of could get people back in line, and, you know, while they wouldn't endorse it, they at least wouldn't openly come out. In Brazil, much more widespread condemnation. And so I think in both cases, I think my reading is that these outbreaks of violence have backfired and have discouraged and have discredited these kinds of actors. You know, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers in the US, they were bigger in 2020 and 21 than they are now. And I think that is a very important fact because, you know, my sense is also in the United States, these militias and groupings are much more organized and therefore much more dangerous than they are in Brazil. I'm not aware in Brazil that you have any equivalent to sort of organized militia kind of groupings. And I think in Brazil, the result is, in the short run, and I think also in the medium run, that the Lula government has been strengthened by this. That you have this, amazing, shocking outbreak of violence. Everybody condemns it. And I think Lula ends up strengthened. And I think what all of that shows as well is that Trump has a much stronger grip over part of the Republican Party than Bolsonaro has in keeping a movement together. I mean, Bolsonaro never had he couldn't take over a party. Bolsonaro's movement is totally unorganized. And as you saw right after his electoral defeat, a lot of his former allies abandoned him. And in the Brazilian kind of physiologista give and take system of patronage and whatever, any opposition has an incentive of cozying up to the incumbent government. And so a lot of former Bolsonaro supporters have abandoned him. Trump has much more staying power than Bolsonaro. And you see the reaction of them after the electoral defeat. Trump is still in there, wants to run again and all that kind of thing. Bolsonaro sort of skulked away and disappeared and withdrew and had not very much to say and didn't really contest. So my reading is, I think Bolsonarismo is gone. I think Bolsonaro is done and finished. Trump is still out there. And so, I think the outcomes in that sense are different in the two countries. But I think in both cases, the violence as such has discredited the perpetrators.
Yeah, I agree with you in general, but I just disagree with the lack of planning or consequences, or the lack of a route to a coup. Because in reality, what seems to have happened is that they have been planning this for, I mean, Bolsonaro spent the 4 years of his administration almost preaching the discredit of the electoral process and a military intervention, or doing anything that he could to create an authoritarian regime. And he was stopped every time by different forces, by the Congress and by the Supreme Court, especially by the Supreme Court that eventually became his enemy. But and of course, when he lost the election, he entered in this weird depression, and stopped doing anything, and had a disease in his feet and whatever it was, and he spent all this time, and then he escaped, right? I mean, he left the country, but there was one card that they were playing, which was the chaos in Brasilia, with bombs that, one at least that did not explode, thank God, but also with this riot that were extensively called, and they had even a nickname for it called Selma, right? So it was called, and it's impossible that the intelligence services of the three armed forces and the ABIN, the presidency, would not alert, because everybody knew it was happening, and 100 buses go to Brasilia. But the goal there was to create such a chaotic situation that they had to declare a GLO, this emergency situation that Temer has had decreed in Rio de Janeiro during the narco-trafficking things there, that authorizes the army to intervene. They may have thought that Lula would be stupid enough to do that, and if they did that, the military command in Brasilia, that was supporting the Bolsonaristas for 60 days in front of them, while they were preaching a violent coup or civil war, they talk openly about civil war, those people would be in charge. And in an interview yesterday, Lula explained this very clearly. He said, when the I think it's GLO, when this happened in Rio, the governor were totally put aside. He said he became the Queen of England, and the general took over Rio de Janeiro, and it was a disaster, by the way. So Lula and the justice minister were very smart of not going into that trap, right? So if they had done that, we would have seen a situation very different, because there is obviously an opposition in the armed forces to Lula, and a sort of sympathetic to Bolsonaro, not enough to get that captain who started his public life as a rebel young officer who wanted to put terrorist bombs in Rio, and was almost expelled from the army. They were not expelled because the army was coward in that moment and made an agreement to let him go. So this is the mentality of that guy. So the army is not engaged in this coup, but that GLO would give a track. So there was a plan, I believe, behind it. Maybe a weak plan. You're right. It was not a traditional thing, but anyway. The other thing is that they were not strong enough to do a very good replica, like Sean was talking about, the significance of the moment of January 6th, because they had December 12th, which was the Brazilian moment of the certification, which is not done by the Congress, but is done by the Electoral Court. And they start riots. They try to invade the federal police. They burn buses. They try to create that kind of chaos there, and nothing happened. Nobody was arrested. They invade the federal police in the capital city, and not one person was arrested. So that is my response to that. Sean, what do you think?
Right. So I have a question for the two of you. So two different questions. The first question is, do we have any evidence that Bolsonaro incited this, or right, like none? And then my second question is, how important was this that it happened in Brazil, right? Just the functioning of the capital being in Brasilia instead of in Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, where, right, like, right, Brasilia is the center of the country, but it's not the center of activity in the country, right? Yeah. Where Washington, D.C. is right in the middle of the Eastern Seaboard, right? So it seems to me part of, right, the difference here is that when buses are going to Brasilia, it's pretty easy to track the buses and who's on the bus and stuff like that. Where in D.C. people showed up, right? And it looks like they stayed at a couple different hotels, but that's as much of a consolidation as we get until we have the events on January 6th.
Gordon.
Yeah. So I mean, if you want to put this in context, I mean, and especially consider the role of the military. First of all, the Brazilian military, I think the lower ranks were much more in favor of Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro, as you said, started as a captain, essentially demanding what in Brazil we call the corporate demands of the military, right? Higher salaries, those kinds of things. Yeah. So lower ranks. And as a president, there was a good amount of concern that he would have support among the lower ranks, and the lower ranks might do things sort of on their own without even the generals kind of guiding it. The Brazilian military as an institution is a very, I don't know, rational and prudent institution that has in mind the national interest of the country and that sees itself as the embodiment of the national interest. So they liked Bolsonaro because he allowed them to get influence in the government and to do things that they thought were important for Brazil's national interest. But they were also always ambivalent about the guy because they know he is a weird head and he's a whack head, and he, is not, I mean, he's so personalistic and so extremist and so discrediting of Brazil that they used him, but they were never really on board, right? And so there was, there was concern that with the election, and they tried to sort of interfere in the election system, that there would be some kind of move, but they never really made a move because, I mean, for the Brazilian military nowadays to make anything resembling a coup, it would be so on the world stage, so totally illegitimate. One of the big goals of Brazil and the Brazilian military is to enhance Brazil's standing and reputation in the world as a leader of the region, the leader of the BRICS. And so you don't make a coup, you would get in a ton of trouble. And I mean, what you also see is very different from Trump. Bolsonaro didn't really make a lot of serious moves to challenge the election results, partly because the Brazilian election system is so efficient. When you think of it, the Brazilian presidential election was counted and the result was established within 3 hours of the polls closing. What are you going to debate? In the United States, what a mess, right? I mean, Trump initially was ahead by 770,000 votes in the state of Pennsylvania. Then there's more counting, then there's days and nights, and that can give rise to conspiracies and to questions and to doubts. In Brazil, shut and done, 3 hours. What are you going to contest? So there was no real post-electoral contestation. There was no opening, there was no space for Bolsonaro to challenge anything, for the military to get involved. And so, yes, I think in the military, especially among the lower ranks, there are sympathies for Bolsonaro, and they're probably coddled and protected and didn't contest the Bolsonaro people who camped out in front of the military barracks. And I mean, different from the US, they didn't fight the invaders of Congress like in the United States, the police did, but they let them go ahead. But for them to risk the institutional authority and standing of the military to get involved in this, I think that is just not going to happen. And so this is, which also means this was, in my view, in Brazil, especially in Brazil, because as Sean asked, Bolsonaro, there's no evidence that Bolsonaro really instigated it. Bolsonaro had left. So I think especially in Brazil, this was just an act of kind of, I don't know how to say that, irrational vandalism. It was nothing like a coup attempt. There was no plan. There was no project for taking power. So it was kind of a useless kind of, act of destruction and violence that I think is backfiring quite significantly.
Well, I would disagree a little bit. You're right, and half full, half empty glass. Because in reality, Bolsonaro had a plan. Bolsonaro always had a plan. Bolsonaro had a plan of the return since 1988, when he wanted to put bombs in Rio. He wanted the return of a military dictatorship in Brazil. That was the plan, and even if you argue, and you're going to be right, that he did not say, hey, people, let's go everybody to Brasilia on January 8th. This was done in an organized way, and it was done with the complicity of the police. Because one thing that Bolsonaro did, and Kurt is totally right on how Bolsonaro became all these decades that he did nothing in Congress, but he was always the champion of more salaries to the not more salaries and more power, not only to military, but the police. And during his administration, he not only promoted the armamentism, that everybody should have a weapon, but he also took care of the police. And the number of people from the police who entered the politics and have names like captain or colonel or delegado, commissioner of police in their name to be a candidate is really amazing. But I think it's maybe there was not a very good plan. Maybe they had several stupid plans and they were failing one after the other, but they had a plan. And also, I agree with you with the level of sophistication of the armed forces in Brazil, in the sense of it's not, you know, I should not use this political heavy term of banana republic, but anyway, Brazil is not, even in Brazil's military dictatorship, it was different from, you know, one leader going there and doing things. It was very institutional and very connected with the rest. But the other question that Sean had was, I forgot, but it was the similarity between Bolsonaro and Trump, or the difference, because Trump was in the big party, a big old party. Bolsonaro doesn't even have a party. He has never had a party. So, you know, now his party is negotiating to support Lula. So he's kaput.
So, right, and this gets back a little bit to what Kurt was saying, right? And I agree with you, Kurt. I think both far-right movements were hurt by what happened on January 6th and January 8th. But what's interesting is that, right, there's still this core group around January 6th who, right, like this sentiment still exists in the United States. And, right, we think that if Trump runs for the nomination again, he's the odds-on favorite. In Bolsonaro, right, like it seems like he's a defeated candidate and we'll never hear from him again. So help us try to understand like how these reactions, I think among the public opinion would be exactly the same, but yet, right, when we see how it has affected the leadership of right, Bolsonaro and Trump, we get these really divergent kind of outcomes, right? Are these institutional factors at play or cultural or?
I think, as Rosental said, I think one of the big differences is the role of the party system, because what you have in the United, I mean, Trump is in some sense unusual because he's a populist outsider who didn't know whether he was a Democrat or a Republican, and then takes over one of the parties. And I mean, you know, one of the main reasons why Trump won in 2016 was party identification, right? I mean, the Republican establishment wanted to keep the guy out as much as they could, but he took over the party and then could use the party, and then they fell in line. And so you have, in some sense, sort of a strange synergy between Trumpian populism and sort of that institutional factor in Brazil. I mean, different from Trump, Bolsonaro had been out there, and Bolsonaro had been spouting his totally extremist hard-right discourse that is worse than Trump's, much worse than Trump's, for 30 years. And everybody had been like, oh, who is this weirdo sitting in Congress like the worst kind of extremist? I mean, the amazing thing in Brazil is that Bolsonaro's well-known extremism could catch on and end up winning an electoral majority. But as quickly as, in some sense, Bolsonaro rose on combination of anti-leftism, of a long-standing economic crisis, in some sense, if you wish, much more of a conjunctural factor, the same way that he rose with much less kind of sustenance than Trump, because there wasn't a party to build on, the same way he drops and falls into a hole and has very little to stand on. And I mean, why is Bolsonaro leaving Brazil? Because he has to worry about being held legally liable for all the awful things he did in Brazil. In the United States, you know, Trump is a master in avoiding legal accountability. He has done that for 40 years. He will always somehow escape and never say exactly something that gets him in trouble. But of course, in Brazil, I mean, that's why Bolsonaro quit. That's why Bolsonaro's sons got Italian citizenship. So they can say, oh, we're just leaving. And, you know, we don't want to be extradited. I mean, so many Latin American presidents have ended up in prison, you know. And so Bolsonaro, not only does he not have a leg to stand on anymore, I mean, as Rosental said, his own party is supporting his opponent 2 months after he lost the election. But he faces a risk being in Brazil. He has good reason to get himself out of there and never to appear again.
So he still is in Florida today? Is that where he is?
As
Yes,
far, yeah, as far as I know.
yes.
And then I think the next, if he has to leave Florida, because I mean he's there with a diplomatic visa, which is kind of weird. Now
Yeah.
he's not the president anymore. I think if he had to leave, he would probably go like to Italy or somewhere.
The United States give 30 days after his arrival for changing the visa, because he's still with the diplomatic visa. But and also it's interesting that you mentioned the prison. I think the thing is that Trump is a pro. Trump is a professional cheater. I mean, I remember in 1988 or 89, I wrote, I was a correspondent in Washington. I wrote a story about his book, The Art of the Deal, right? Where he teaches how to cheat clients, I mean, openly, and he never, so I think Trump really are not afraid of going to jail, but Bolsonaro seems to be convinced that he will end up going to jail, and I think that I believe that this is the reason he left. He mentioned more than once what happened with the woman from Bolivia,
Áñez, Janine Áñez.
yeah, who is in jail, the former president who is in jail after the left came back. So he knew it could happen. But Sean, do you think Trump is going to escape forever? That his certainty of impunity is?
I mean, it seems like since even before he ran for president that he's always been like a month or two away from being indicted on one of these things. And it seems like these people just keep gathering information and they keep gathering information, but no one pulls the trigger, right? So we hear that the investigation in Georgia, where he tried to get public officials to do things that they can't do, we hear, right, like that this investigation is wrapping up and they're getting really close to issuing an indictment, but we haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
And so, Trump is going to leave the United States before he ends up in jail, but I'm not sure that, right, he's a master, as you say, of the legal system.
Oh, yeah.
So, right, I just think he's not a young man, right? So I think that he just punts this down the road until it becomes, right, a non-story.
Yeah, there is a question from the audience. Did social media play a similar role in both countries' polarization? I understand that WhatsApp is used in Brazil more broadly. And if so, was it used to coordinate the incidents? And the person also say, I doubt that people just showed up without early planning and coordination. The answer is yeah. I mean, everything in Brazil is on WhatsApp. If you have a medical doctor appointment, to make the appointment, you need WhatsApp. To talk to the doctor is with your WhatsApp. You can buy things, you can buy supermarket, everything on WhatsApp. But WhatsApp is not the place anymore. They use Telegram, because WhatsApp, it belongs to Meta, to Facebook, and they are more subject to controls, and there are other ways. But the planning was open, wasn't on Instagram, on WhatsApp, on everywhere, and it's just the police let it. But the other thing of the culpability of Bolsonaro, of what happened there, is the series of lies. I mean, the continuous lie. I mean, those people who were there were the, how do you call it in English, the cannon fodder. They were the mass, the useful idiots that were there vandalizing things. Although among them there are signals that there were some professionals, some people who knew where the weapons in the presidential palace were, people who knew tactic of conflict and fight. So there were probably some police and military there also. But of course, social media created this bubble of lies, and that what motivates that is because people are convinced that there was fraud in the election. They are asking for the source code of the machines, the voting machines in Brazil. This has been already open. It's a lot of lies that happen that, and that's a proof that, you know, people say, oh, freedom of expression, you can, you know, people are now advocating that you do have the right to scream fire in a crowded theater, which is ridiculous. I mean, there are things, maybe there are some exaggerations in the Supreme Court, but there are things happening there that are stopping, and they stopped Bolsonaro, and they now stop this movement. And I agree with Kurt that Lula gets out of this stronger. And let's see what's going to happen tomorrow when he meets the commandantes of the armed forces, the three armed forces.
So
Can I make a comment? Oh, Sean.
Yes.
yeah. So, right, does authoritarian populism like disappear in Brazil? Like, is this the death knell of it?
I mean, what you have is you have a sort of a floating fluid popular base still around, but I think it will depend on some new leader capturing this and whipping it up again. Otherwise, I mean, you know, I think without Trump, a lot of these deplorables would just slink away and abstain and hide and not get involved, right? I mean, they need a leader. I mean, populism is very leader-centric. So you can have these diffuse sentiments there, and you can have a popular constituency, but on their own, they don't act. I mean, populism is defined by having an outstanding leader who mobilizes his people, through whom that mass acts. And so, you know, there is in some sense sort of a potential for it, and somebody might be able to arouse it again. But I mean, when you think of it, the conjuncture that allowed Bolsonaro to get elected was very unusual. I mean, there had been 14 years of PT government, there was strong anti-leftism, there was a huge corruption scandal, there had been one of the worst economic crises in Brazil. So several things came together. And the
stabbing.
Yeah, and so there was kind of an unusual conjuncture that allowed Bolsonaro, a total weirdo who had been considered discredited outsider in the Congress, to suddenly kind of emerge on top. And that is not a conjuncture that's very likely to, because I mean, in some sense, I have to say, I've known Brazil for many, many years. Some kind of really hard, right, ugly political movement like Bolsonarismo, to me, kind of seems un-Brazilian. You know, the Brazilian culture is not sort of, you know, harsh and resentful. And I mean, I think you would have more, if I can make a dangerous national character statement, you know, in Chile has a harsher kind of feel, or Argentina, there's more resentment between the Peronists and the anti-Peronists. Brazil tends to be kind of, you know, more easygoing. And so it was in some sense surprising that somebody like Bolsonaro, who for 30 years had been in the wilderness, politically speaking, because he was so extremist, could suddenly kind of turn into this leader who could, in this conjuncture, win a majority. So.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that you know, from this obscurity where he was operating on those years of weirdo, I love the expression for him. He was saying, and there is a video that he was saying, the only solution for Brazil is a civil war, that 30,000 people at least die. I mean, he preached that. This is the guy who Brazil elected president, but I agree with Kurt that there is nothing more un-Brazilian than this, because, you know, we did not even have a real war for independence. We were, you know, we have violence. Is a violent society, is a society that has, you know, oppression and racism and things that are very ugly, but it's all done in a way that, oh, yeah, more or less, it's not exactly the jeitinho, the thing that, and he comes with this brutality, but you know, there are followers, you know, there are thousands of people, and people. There's another question here: what
Oh,
do
actually,
you
can
do?
I jump in
Yeah,
here first, Rosental?
go.
Right, I want to push it against both of you just a little bit, right? In thinking about Bolsonaro, right? The way that you've described him, like out in the political wilderness, and there's a confluence of factors that come together. He's elected, right? Then there's a pandemic, and I'm not sure that there was a less responsible leader of a country during the pandemic than
There was
Bolsonaro.
none.
He continues all of the crazy things that he is saying before his election.
Mhm.
Then there's another election, and he got 49.1% of the vote. Like,
Yeah, but
Well-
against whom? I mean, when you think against whom, we think that Lula
Yes.
is a hero. Many people think that Lula is a left-winger, that Lula's party ran the country into the ground. Lula himself was in prison for a year and a half because of involvement in corruption. He was let off the hook, if you wish, on a technicality. And personally, I'm not sure Lula is usually corrupt, but that corruption network that his party organized, and that by any plausibility, the president of a country would kind of know where the funds come from that his party uses. I mean, so, we think that Lula is a hero and Bolsonaro is a sinner. But I mean, there was a good amount of trouble and dirt on both sides, right?
Yeah.
This was not kind of, a pure hero against the ugly Bolsonaro. And so, yes, Bolsonaro came up, but against, and as an incumbent, right? I mean, when you think of it, similar to it's not very likely for populist incumbents to lose elections because they use all kinds of tricks, as Bolsonaro did. Bolsonaro got the Congress to change the constitution in order to increase pre-electoral spending. So when you look at Latin American populism, or populism in the Western Hemisphere with presidents, it's a very rare phenomenon that a populist incumbent who is allowed to run for re-election loses. I can only think of, in recent years, of two: Trump in the US and Bolsonaro in Brazil. Every other populist president in Latin America who was allowed to run for re-election won. Menem won, Uribe won, Fujimori won, Chavez won. They all win. Those two are the only ones who lost.
Yeah, and I also would say that Bolsonaro core nucleus, nobody knows exactly what it is, but it's nothing more than 15% or 20%. What Kurt is trying to say is that there is a sentiment against Lula that is very strong, especially in the middle class, in people who think that if we have more social justice, for example, they're gonna lose, because in order to not having millions of people starving in Brazil, is because they're gonna ask me to give something, and this selfishness is one of the factors. The other is that I mean, he had this, he almost won because he used all the tricks, very with borderline or illegal ways of expenditure. That was a scandal. I mean, the surprise is that even doing that, he did not win. So, but what is the similarity with Trump here? Because also, what do you think is the Trump nucleus, the hard nucleus?
right, and this is exactly right, the comparison contrast that I want to make, right? Like, I think that the conventional wisdom right now in the United States is that Trump, for whatever reason, legal reasons, health reasons, right, steps aside, that another person kind of becomes the head of his movement, right? A Trump
Someone from Florida, maybe.
Right. I mean, perhaps DeSantis or Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley or
Abbott.
like any one of these guys would, right? Like, I think that the way that we think about it today is that any one of those guys would I was going to say just as good, would be fine at keeping that core together, right? Like, and that core is now a majority of the Republican Party. And what's interesting to me is, right, if right, maybe I'm taking this comparison too far, but like it seems like with Bolsonaro, like he's gone, and according to Kurt, like it's over.
Yeah, I don't think it's over and completely over. I think what I heard from Kurt is that Bolsonaro is over, but I think the right movement that is diffuse and gain another status in Brazil, and we have to see what's gonna come. And there is no DeSantis or other character in Brazil that may take the flag and keep going, right? Kurt, what do you think?
So I actually want to ask Sean, because when I think of charismatic movements, they're very personalistic. And so you had in the US, you had these deplorables who felt excluded and neglected and despised by people like us and by the Austin, Texas, because they live in flyover country and the hinterland and ravaged by the opioid epidemic and whatever, right? So here comes Trump and kind of gives them some sense of dignity, right? Of being the real Americans, of speaking for them. The crazy thing that this billionaire claims to speak for the deplorables of the hinterland, right? But he lifted them out of that sense of neglect and exclusion. And I think that is deeply personal. And I do not think that any DeSantis or whatever could easily take that over. Because you are a Trumpian. You can't be rented out to somebody else, and somebody else can't easily take over. I mean, succession in these charismatic movements is a complicated thing. It's not, and especially not very easy to hand over. So my former student, Caitlin Andrews, wrote a great book about succession in populist movements. And there's not easy kind of, here's Trump until 2023, and then comes DeSantis 2024. In Argentine Peronism, you have kind of one leader falling. There are fallow years when the movement is again out of power, and then a new leader rises and picks it up again. That works, but kind of immediate handover, immediate takeover, that DeSantis says, you used to be Trumpians and now you are DeSantisites or whatever. I do not think that works very well. And so, I mean, if Trump gets pushed aside and DeSantis becomes candidate of the Republican Party, he might well win or whatever. But I think a whole bunch of the real hardcore Trumpians are just going to slink away and go back to their Appalachian hollows and their, little villages and their little towns, and are going to be depressed and frustrated and don't vote anymore, and kind of sort of seep away in the American political system. That would be my sense.
So I disagree. Let me partially agree. Right, like I think that Trump is good at assembling the coalition that got him elected, and I think that it may have taken someone like Trump to assemble that coalition. But I think now that coalition has been has gotten together, and they become politicized, and so even if Trump kind of exits stage right, I think that there's someone else who could come along and largely keep that entire coalition together because they've learned Trump's language, right? So they would use the same sorts of ways of whipping up that crowd in the same way that Trump does. So that's first. And second, I think negative partisanship is really impactful in the United States. So, right, maybe DeSantis isn't quite as the charismatic leader of Trump, but by God, on the other side is Joe Biden, who might as well be in a coma in their views. And so I think they stay active. And I think, again, the conventional wisdom is he keeps that coalition together, but he doesn't piss as many people in the middle off. And he becomes the most likely person, I think, today to become.
So, but don't you think that one difference is that we had here, the ultra-right movement cooking since the mid-90s, and with that movement with Gingrich and now the what's it called, the group, the movement, the
Tea Party.
Yes, the Tea Party movement. Then Trump took a ride in a movement that was coming. In Brazil, I don't think there was a Tea Party equivalent, right, Kurt? And the phenomenon of Bolsonaro was just because of the explanation he gave about about the Lava Jato corruption scandal, plus the anger against the social agenda of the PT and an anger against PT, etc. Right, Kurt? What do you think?
Yeah, no. So there also, I mean, Sean, you think and argue in terms of coalition, which suggests some kind of sort of organized category. I mean, my understanding and reading of populist and charismatic movements is that they're very fluid and very feebly organized and very personalistic, personality centered. And in the United States, of course, a lot of people abstain. There is no obligatory voting. And Trump, I mean, when you think of it, Trump between 2016 and 2020, I think he got 7 million more votes. So Trump mobilized people who before couldn't be bothered because they didn't have any trust that any political would do anything. And I mean, I think in 2016, he already probably mobilized a whole bunch of people who before had been completely disaffected and completely left out. And I think a good part of that crowd is just going to go away. So part of the Trump coalition, the more organized part, the more, the part that's held together by a Republican Party ID, they are available for some other leader to take over. But I mean, when you think how tight American elections are, whatever, 10 million Trumpians, I think are just going to, they're Trumpians and they're going to cry if Trump leaves, but they're not going to say, oh, well, Trump is gone, let's do lesser evil and second best and go for DeSantis. They say they're going to build an altar for Trump in our house, but we're not going to, this has not worked. This system is, won't change ever, and we just are disaffected again and stay back home.
We have to recognize our leader here, our fearless leader,
our
Professor
leader
Marcelo Paixão,
forever. Sorry about that. You are our eternal leader. Sorry, Sean. Sorry, Kurt, Paloma, Rosental. I had a personal emergency and I couldn't be here to introduce you. And first of all, I'd like to, on behalf of Brazil Center, to acknowledge your time, your service, your contribution for our for this debate, for this moment. And thank you all for that. Sorry about that. And as I'm here, and I was really excited to have this conversation with you, maybe you have already addressed this issue, okay? And so sorry about that. And I hope we still have some time. But I would like to listen to you, including you, Rosental, because you know that Bolsonaro and Trump, they are characterized by their extreme nationalist rhetoric. And at the same time, this kind of stance is related to a thing called the white supremacism, or at least here in the United States. And Rosental, I had a time, I listened to you mentioning that Lula is not supported nowadays by the white middle class. I will not mention about the racial makeup of the social layer in Brazil, but I think that these characteristics help me to see some connections about that, the ethnic, racial component of this debate, considering the extreme nationalist rhetoric. If you have already addressed this issue, sorry about that, you need to talk to me again. If not, I'd like to listen to you about how do you see and the connection, because you know that Trump and Bolsonaro, they are best friends forever, the dialogue that they establish and the way that this issue, how do you think that this issue in some sense shape that coalition? And again, on behalf of Brazil Center, thanks for your contribution for the dissemination of Brazilian issues in our community.
Well, we have not touched on this very important issue. I think that there is we mentioned in general that how the middle class in Brazil was against the social agenda, which includes race, which includes things like indigenous people, for example, that Bolsonaro explicitly was against any concession. I mean, has repeatedly said that it was absurd for Brazil to guarantee the lands of the indigenous nations in the Amazon, and that we should go there and take all the minerals and put down the trees, whatever they want. And actually, that indigenous thing is a part of it. But the other part, the conscience and the growth of the Brazilian awareness of social injustice based on race is something that also is not trivialized in the Bolsonaro agenda. Bolsonaro has explicitly, I mean, the guy who was introduced, was nominated or appointed the director or the Instituto Palmares of the, the part of the government that deals with that, was an African descendant who was totally against the agenda of the blacks in Brazil who fight for their rights, which is a fight that has had lots of progress recently, and lots of way, a long way to go. But Bolsonaro kind of interrupted that abruptly, and I think it is important to note that Brazil has, even in that fascination of imitating the United States, Brazil has even some white supremacist movement, which is absolutely ridiculous because they think they are white. And the white supremacists here would laugh at those stupid people who have committed acts of violence. One of the first things that Lula did was a law a couple of days ago that elevated the level of punishment for racism in Brazil. So I don't know if Kurt wants to respond to Marcelo with more.
So what I found interesting is the link between nationalism and race, which in my reading is quite different in Brazil from the United States, because I think in the United States, with the idea, one drop rule of a very clear borderline between white and black, I think nationalism is much more identified with whiteness. In Brazil, there's this idea of, racial democracy. I mean, when you think of it, Fernando Henrique Cardoso went around saying that he had African ancestry, right? I mean, so it's a very different, I think, understanding of nationhood, where Bolsonaro's racism was in some sense, I think, was less linked to nationalism in that sense, because I think in Brazil, with that idea of a continuum of where is the exact borderline, I think the relationship between nationalism and race, as I'm very much a non-specialist on this, but looking at it comparatively, I think the relationship is quite different in the two countries.
Right, and I would just juxtapose, right, what we were talking about before Marcelo joined the conversation, and then his question is that I think what critical differences here between Brazil and the United States is the party system, the strength of the party system in the United States, and then also, right, the clear distinction about race in the long history of race in the United States. Right, the strong populist movement, nationalistic movement in the United States extends back, right, not to the 1990s, not even to the 1960s, but right, we can go all the way back to Jim Crow and well before that, right? And this strain has existed in the United States for a long time. And so, Kurt, right, I can't believe that at the end of this conversation, you're going to be the optimist and I'm going to be the pessimist. But I think once these people get activated on these issues, I just don't think they slink away. I think they're here for good. And I think that, right, and part of my concern is the 10 million new voters that you say that Trump brought to the polls that slink away. He also brought 11 million more anti-Trump voters to the polls. And my concern is if it's DeSantis and not Trump, like a lot of those folks go away. Like I mean, DeSantis sure seems a lot less threatening to people than I think Trump did.
So here I have actually a question for you, Sean, because I mean, to have a little background, I mean, one thing that was surprising about both Bolsonaro and Trump is this whole idea of electoral fraud, because I mean, plausibly, it's the government that employs fraud against the opposition, right? So here have incumbent presidents who have this crazy idea to claim there's electoral fraud, right? Which, especially in Brazil, makes absolutely no sense because the process is completely centralized, not like in the United States, where you have this strange system where a federal election is run by the counties and supervised by the states. There was some kind of plausibility that may be something, right? But so that whole idea of electoral fraud. Now, what I found very interesting, you had in the US midterm elections, a whole bunch of Trumpian election deniers. And as far as I understand, every single one who ran for an office that would have operational control over election, Secretary of State, whatever, you know, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, every single one lost. And what I found even more striking is, except for, if I recall, Kerry Lake and a couple of other figures in Arizona, not a single one, you know, repeated that election denial line about their loss. They weren't like, oh, I lost and there must have been fraud. They said, I lost. This was a fair process. I concede my loss and I go home. Isn't that a very encouraging signal? Doesn't that show that even those, first of all, the American people, even the Republican Party is not Trumpian enough that they would have elected those people. The American electorate, there is enough of a constituency that says, you know, I might be a Republican, I might like, but I'm not going for this. And what I found especially striking is the candidates themselves kind of bent back and accepted again the fundamental norm of American politics that elections are clean and when you lose, you concede. I found that a very encouraging signal.
I think, right, absolutely encouraging. The one correction I would make to your claim about the people running the elections all lost, right, all the challengers, but there are lots of incumbents in lots of states that were election deniers that were returned to their office. I mean, states that we don't talk about on election night, right? And so it wasn't that everyone that mouthed this line from Trump ended up losing, but right, like if you're in a competitive race and you weren't in the incumbent, then right, you lost a lot of those races, right? There are lots of senators that were reelected who are election deniers. And there are lots.
But
of,
I mean, people who have actually direct
like,
operational control over election administration because they were concerned those people get elected, then they're going to mess around in 2024, right?
I think that's largely true. But I'm just concerned that right, for as many people that Trump mobilizes, I think the counter mobilization is even greater. And so I don't know if they become counter mobilized to DeSantis in quite the same way. And I think that he's still going to be using a lot of these lines of right, rigged elections and stuff like that Trump used.
I wouldn't be surprised at all if that counter mobilization also diminishes, you know, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if in some sense DeSantis, I mean, I'm not a specialist in American politics at all. I'm not even an American citizen, don't vote, whatever. But I wouldn't be surprised if DeSantis would have an easier time winning a general election than Trump. I think Trump is much more likely, if he wants to win the candidacy of the Republican Party. But I think he has also a good chance of losing, whereas DeSantis would have a much harder time in the primary against Trump if Trump. But I think he would have a better chance of winning in a general election.
Oh, I don't disagree with that at all.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
but now
I hope that Donald Trump gets the nomination.
But when you talk about optimism, for many, many years of my life, I've been a pessimist. Now that everybody is becoming a pessimist just to annoy him, I'm becoming an optimist. And so what I am struck by, there was a lot of concern when Trump got elected and a lot of concern when Bolsonaro got elected that there would be democracy dies like Levitsky and Zieblatt, and, you know, that there would be very serious democratic backsliding and democracy would suffer real damage. I personally do not think, especially in institutional terms, and as political scientists, we're especially interested in institutional terms, I do not think that either Trump or Bolsonaro did a lot of damage to Brazilian and American democracy. And I'm impressed by how resilient both Brazilian and American democracy were to the very serious challenge. They tried, they wanted to the very serious challenge that those two right-wing populist leaders pose. And I think it shows the strength of institutions, and it shows that when push comes to shove, there's enough democratic spirit in both of those countries and both of those societies. And also that power is sufficiently broadly distributed in both of those presidential systems that, man, even a Bolsonaro and even a Trump, in the end, can't do all that much damage.
No, I agree with you about the resiliency of institutions and democracy in the United States, but I disagree with you that they didn't cause harm to the countries. I mean, I don't know Brazil.
The country, no, sure. But I mean, democracy.
And harm to American democracy. There are a lot more people that are skeptical about how we run our elections these days, right? And just the basic functioning of American democracy than ever were before, with no legitimate reason.
In terms of norms and beliefs, I agree. In terms of institutions, you know, because the real dangerous thing when these populists change institutions, mess around with the electoral law, have a constituent assembly, you know, pass laws and decrees that concentrate power, really very, very.
Well, this is a good segue for one thing that we have just 5 minutes, right? But one thing that concerns me a lot in this anti-democratic international movement, that coordinated or not, is like a wave that is sweeping many countries. In Latin America, I am from the time, and I covered several coups d'etats, military coups in the 70s, in the 80s. And follow others in the 60s, like the Brazilian one. And all the coups were done for, I mean, they destroyed democracy on behalf of democracy. They were saving the country from the evil of communism that was the opposition of the liberal democracy of the Western world. And that was the purpose of the coups. Right, so the situation that we have now with the coup that Bolsonaro wanted, and it's clear that they wanted. There's no need to have proof of that. It is not, or the situation of Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega became this bloody dictator, ruthless, cruel, in a way that was unimaginable, or the aspirations of Bukele in El Salvador, or what Hugo Chavez and Maduro have done in Venezuela, or what Correa tried to do in Ecuador. All of that is not based on saving from communism, although some of them, like Bolsonaro, talk about communism. It's to end democracy. You know, it's but my question is, what would Trump do if the military here had supported, or if the Congress would not certify Biden? Was, you know, not to propose anything new, but an authoritarian regime, right or wrong? We have 2 minutes, so maybe the final.
Sean, I want to hear from you. What is the horror scenario? What would Trump have done? He wouldn't have declared a dictatorship or whatever? What would have been the worst case scenario?
I mean, I think the worst case scenario is almost what played out, right? Like we just can't imagine that anything would have been any different, right? Like because of what Kurt said earlier, the resiliency of our institutions, the belief in democracy, the military, right? Like none of these people were going to do anything than what they did, right? So the harm that was caused was the bashing of the U.S. Capitol, the violence against the police, the destruction of the temple of democracy. But we couldn't, right? Like there's no other scenario that could have played out that we could even fathom, right? But that's the United States and that's Brazil. My concern is in countries that aren't the United States and Brazil.
No, but I will push back a little bit, Sean. I think that this speech of we are beyond that. This is what we would have imagined before January the 6th. January the 6th is as unpredictable or unimaginable as the victory of Trump to turn around the election. So I am, impressed by the resistance of imagining things beyond democracy in the United States of America, where half of the population vote for a person who has no attachment to democracy and let that crowd do what they did. So it's not because we have our history of coups and dictatorships that we are prone to have that. And because the United States doesn't have that kind of a story, it's not prone to have that. I mean, unimaginable things happen.
And they did on January 6th.
Yes, and that's 5:15. We are exactly punctually in the end of this. I don't know if Marcelo want to say something or
Well,
say
just
goodbye
to
or-
wrap up our conversation, I'd like to over again acknowledge you, Sean, Kurt, and Rosental and Paloma for this brilliant conversation. I personally, although I couldn't follow most part of the debate, my small sample that I could took from from this debate, I really learned a lot. And I believe that you are nowadays undergoing a moment in which you need to struggle for democratic values. And mainly in Brazil, where you do not have this tradition. I totally agree that the United States institutions are very strong to resist against the authoritarian seduction. But in Brazil, 7 constitutions, after 21 years under a military regime, I'm not so optimistic. And so, following what Sean was saying about Kurt, I am an optimist and pessimist at the same time. But anyway, thank you so much for your cooperation with Brazil Center, and I'm wrapping up that activity. Thank you a lot, all our listeners and the watchers.